Alright folks, thank you for joining me on another weekly tutorial as I endeavour to walk you through the Bible story in a year, and to do so more or less in a chronological fashion, although at times we will sacrifice a little bit of the chronology for the sake of reading whole chunks of scripture together, and that's exactly what we're doing this week as we start the Book of Ezekiel, and that's all we're doing. We're just reading the first 22 chapters of Ezekiel. Okay, so my job here week after week is to help you see where the story fits in the big picture and remind you of the one story threading through the entire story as we go. Alright, so here we go. Last week I explained how Ezekiel ended up in Babylon during the second campaign against Jerusalem by King Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, so basically God's people are in Judah, Jerusalem. Okay, King Nebuchadnezzar from Babylon is the world empire of the time. He makes 3 campaigns against God's people during each of the last 3 kings and takes away people into captivity every time. Well, Ezekiel is part of that second wave. There's about 8 to 10,000 people. King Jehoiachin himself, the king, okay, one of David's descendants, is taken away into Babylon as well. And then about 10 years later, King Nebuchadnezzar comes back and destroys the city, and of course we've read about that the last couple of weeks. Well, Ezekiel is there in Babylon. He's not therefore part of the destruction, and about 4 or 5 years into his exile, he has an encounter with God. His prophetic ministry is launched, and that is where we get the book of Ezekiel. Now, what's really fascinating is it opens in chapter 1 verse 1 by saying, "In my 30th year I had this vision." And that's actually a really key thing, because Ezekiel is from a priestly family, and if he were in Jerusalem at the temple, he would have began his priestly service, according to Numbers chapter 4, at the temple at the age of 30. Alright, but he's not at the temple on his 30th birthday. He is in Babylon, and yet God still honors his calling as a priest and encounters him at 30 years of age. And interestingly enough, his prophetic ministry lasts for 20 years. Okay, so from the age of 30 to the age of 50, and the age of 50 is when the priest would retire from their ministry at the temple. Okay, so there's this real thing. God's meeting this priest with a prophetic ministry in Babylon during those years where he should be serving at the temple. Alright, that is pretty cool. So here's Ezekiel. He's out there in Babylon, and God is encountering him in many, many ways, and you're going to really enjoy Ezekiel as you start this week. There's a few things I've noticed about Ezekiel I want to highlight to you, and then I want to encourage you to read it, the scriptures this week in 3 major sections. Okay, first thing I found out about Ezekiel as I read him again this week is the book is really well organized. Okay, very organized, very structured, and therefore, in my understanding, very easy to read. All right, the chapter divisions, which Ezekiel didn't put there, but anyway, the chapter divisions are really well set. He often begins his prophecies by saying, you know, the hand of the Lord was on me, or then the word of the Lord came to me, and it's kind of a whole new division starts. And also what you find in the book of Ezekiel is he doesn't mix his genres as much as like Jeremiah or Isaiah do. You know how in Jeremiah and Isaiah we read a whole bunch of prophecy and then it went into chapters of narrative. Well, Ezekiel doesn't do that. It's basically 98% prophecy. Alright? The various tiniest bit of narrative in there. So almost all prophecy, you know, visions, dreams, revelation, word of the Lord, or prophetic laments at times, but it's basically, that is all it is, a collection of prophecy, which in my mind makes it nice and easy to follow, because you can categorize it nice and cleanly. Alright? And basically it's also set out pretty well chronologically. Every now and again you'll come across a chapter which will say, you know, in the 6th year of our exile, or this 8th year of our exile, and pretty well it runs chronologically through, which also makes it, unlike Jeremiah, much easier to follow. So I really like that about Ezekiel. It's very organized, but it's also very mystical. Okay, in his experiences, probably more than any other prophet, he really explains to us these incredible heavenly visions, and right there in chapter 1 it begins with the wheels within wheels and the angels with their eyes and all that type of thing. So probably far more than any other, very, very mystical in his language, and very creative in the way that he communicates to other people. You're going to see him lie on his side and build a model of Jerusalem out of clay that he's going to prophesy against. You're going to see him cutting off his hair and dividing it into 3 portions. All right, so he's a very creative type of person, as well as very mystical in his heavenly encounters, and that really shines out as you read this week. He's also very similar to other prophets. He uses much of the same language of Isaiah and Jeremiah, prophesies much of the same things. You're going to, be reading thinking, I get the point. All these guys are basically saying the same thing. And he also echoes the language of Moses, as all the prophets do. All right, and even when his first mystical encounter, when he sees the angels and all that, it's a picture. It's all Moses' language of what Moses saw on Mount Sinai and what Moses built when he built the Ark of the Covenant with the wings of the cherubim. So it's very much also repeating the language of Moses, but Ezekiel is, like all the prophets, unique in his personality, unique in his character, and you're going to notice that. And probably one of the most unique things about him, and I'll restate this just one more time, everything Ezekiel is prophesying about Jerusalem, because that's his main audience, okay? He's mainly directing his prophecies towards Judah and Jerusalem. All of it is from a distance. He is hundreds of kilometers away in captivity in Babylon, prophesying back to where he is from, even though he is not physically there. All right, he is taken there in visions, but whether he's in the body or out of the body, we're not entirely sure. Okay, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? But he is prophesying from a distance, and also because of his priestly calling, most likely, he has a real emphasis on the temple in Jerusalem. Not so, the city and the land, but also very much the temple, and an emphasis on the glory of God in the temple. So you're definitely going to notice that this week. All right. Here's what we're doing this week. We're reading the first 22 chapters, and I'd like you to read them or to think about them in 3 sections, those 22 chapters, and you might even, because it's a lot to read in one sitting, I don't really expect you to do that, but at least consider these 3 sections of Scripture, the first 7 chapters, 1 to 7, then 8 to 11, and then 12 to 22. So basically remember, 7, 11, 22. Easy, all right? You can read it in 3 sections. Here's basically what you're going to see. In the opening 7 chapters, he has his opening encounter, prophetic words. He speaks to his fellow exiles, and it's all the usual doom and gloom stuff about God coming out against Jerusalem because they're a bunch of sinners, all right? All that type of stuff. The temple will be desecrated, and Jerusalem will fall. We've heard all that stuff before, and it's all repeated here through Ezekiel as he speaks to the exiles in the Babylon, saying this is going to happen to our city at some point in the future. So that's the first section. The second section from chapters 8 to 11 is basically he is taken away in a vision. He's actually lifted up by the hair by a man glowing like fire. I wonder who that could be, okay? So he's taken away to Jerusalem. And this reminded me of Jesus. In Jesus' temptation, after he was baptized, it says the devil took him to the highest point in the temple. Now, was he there in a vision? Was he there physically? Was it a little bit of both? Okay, we don't exactly know. But this is kind of what happened to Ezekiel. He is taken in the spirit to Jerusalem and to the temple in chapters 8 to 11. And what he sees there is all the idolatry that's happening, and most importantly, he sees God's glory come out of the temple, leave the city, and rest on the Mount of Olives. So this is kind of God's way of saying the glory has departed. All right, God has left the building. He's leaving the city, and he's watching from a distance, from the mountain to the east, the Mount of Olives. He's watching from a distance what is about to happen to the city. And of course, the Mount of Olives becomes a significant place in the first century where that portal of glory, as it were, opens up again and the transfiguration takes place. So keep your eye on that, all right? And then, of course, he's taken back to Babylon and is asked to speak to the exiles. So that's the second section, chapter 1 to 7, chapter 8 to 11, and the next session, chapter 12, all the way through the 22, which is basically a whole bunch of prophecies, one after the other, to the people of Judah and Jerusalem, and to the land and to the leaders and all that sort of stuff, basically just saying your destruction is guaranteed and it is imminent. In fact, even if Noah were there, even if Job were there, I would not spare the city for their sake. That's very much that Sodom and Gomorrah language happening there. He uses all the well-worn metaphors about God's people being an adulterous bride. A whole chapter or two chapters is dedicated to that. He talks about them being a vine that's useless, that's burnt up in the fire. All right, so all these same metaphors are repeated with Ezekiel, but even though the disaster is imminent, and even though the disaster will be fatal, there is hope for a remnant to return. King Babylon's sword is coming, but the crown of David's family will be restored when the rightful king comes to his palace. palace, all right? And he even goes right back, Ezekiel, and quotes Jacob in Genesis 49. Do you remember when Jacob had the 12 sons, or his 13 sons, and he's blessing them, okay, before he dies? He says to Judah, the scepter will not depart from you until the promised one comes. Ezekiel echoes that verse and says, with all hope of will the scepter, will the royal line of David ever be established again? He says, yes, it will. The time is coming. So there's these awesome hints of hope again that come through Ezekiel. All right, so read them in those three segments, chapter 7, 11, 22. Just remember that and enjoy Ezekiel this week. That's all we're doing, and we're going to continue on with him next week. So well done, and welcome to October. Those of you watching live, it's a long weekend, so I hope you enjoy your school holidays, and welcome to the new month. Bless you guys heaps. We'll see you next week. And where's my button? Bye.